founded the Fortune Society, and a re-entry program for the formerly incarcerated. But David was one of the last people at the yard in Attica when the uprising happened there, with Ron Kuby's partner, William Kunstler.
Yeah.
And later on, Ed Gavigan, who thank God is not going to tell his car story, will be talking about Elizabeth Taylor, who David Rothenberg, as a gay man, dated here in Manhattan along with Richard Burton when he was representing them on Broadway. So, as David says a lot of times on the radio on WBNI, when he meets someone or somebody up at the Fortune Society, and he'll always say, "Oh, how lucky I am." And I always like to say, no, David, we're the lucky ones to know you.
Yeah.
And he's going to tell us a few stories tonight. And listen, buy his book here, Manhattan Mayhem, or his biography. An unbelievable read. David? You're on.
John, I haven't stayed up this late since the junior prom. When you get older, you go to lights. I used to read from the book, but you know, maybe you should just read it. So I thought of stories. What happens, I worked in the theater, and everyone thought that was glamorous and wonderful, and part of it was. But I never worked on a show that was as dramatic as some of the experiences I had at the Fortune Society. Certainly going to Attica, going to Nicaragua during the war with Ramsey Clark. But I want to tell you quickly, whenever someone says quickly or to make a long story short, be prepared. It never is. But I wanted to, three stories. What happens, when I'm talking with people at Fortune, something comes up and I tell something, relate a story that happened 40 years ago, and we never heard that. So let me tell you a couple of them. One is, Fortune was about 5 years old. We had a staff of about 8 people then. We now have a staff of 500. And I was the only one that had not been formally incarcerated. And the 7 men and 1 woman that worked there always were looking out for me, protecting me, thinking that I was going to be taken for something. And this guy came in one day and he looked like a lot of trouble, and he said he would only talk to me. And Kenny Jackson and Mel Rivers said, no, you can't. And I said, it's all right, I can handle it. And we went into the room, and he told me that he was on the 10 most wanted list, wanted to turn himself in, was afraid they would kill him, and he had seen me on television and thought I could ease the process. Well, you know, you don't get much training in college about how to turn somebody in who's on the 10 most wanted list. So what I did as a former theater press person, I thought, well, the best way to protect somebody who thought he was going to be killed turning himself in is to get media coverage and political coverage. So I called, I think his name was Bill Federici at the Daily News. He was a crime reporter who I had dealt with. And I said, do you want your front page story tomorrow? And he said, what? And I said, I'm going to bring somebody over. And indeed it was the front page story. I also called the one political person in Washington with whom I had contact, my congressman, whose name was Ed Koch. I knew him. And I wanted to make sure that this guy had protection. And I drove him to the news in his chauffeured Rolls Royce. And I said to him, the only things I want to make sure is that you don't mention my name or the Fortune Society's name, so we're not perceived as turning people in. And when I left, he said, you can have the Rolls Royce for the rest of the week. The lease is up then, but I didn't take it. So that's the story. Isn't that riveting? What was the second story? This one is a real pick-me-up. It happened twice in my years at Fortune Society. The most dramatic was I got a call from a man who was living at the castle, and he said, I'm at 116th Street and Lex at the subway, and I'm going to kill myself. Well, that's something else I didn't have much training for. And I said, what do you do? My instinct was just to keep talking. And we talked for about 15 to 20 minutes, and he finally said, give me one good reason why I shouldn't kill myself. And I said, Billy, you would break my heart if you did. and he started to cry, and I figured that was a breakthrough. And I said, meet me at Fortune. And then I quickly called two of the guys at Fortune and said, I'm going to need help on this one. But he came and he arrived, and he didn't take his life.
Yeah.
He died about 5 years ago, but he had another 20 years before that. So the first call I ever got was, the only time I was at the top of the World Trade Center, I got a call from the police saying there's a man threatening to jump. This is before 9/11, obviously, and that he wanted you to come. And I didn't know who it was, and I got into the car, a police car. Police came to pick me up, and Steve Bauman of Channel 5 said, can we tape this? Can we film this live? I said, no, I don't think I want to go to the top of the World Trade Center with cameras trying to rescue somebody. It was a man I didn't know who had heard about me, and he did come down and didn't jump off. So those are my suicide stories. I know the clock is ticking, John. You gave me what, 12 minutes?
No, you got another 5. All right, another 5. Yeah.
I wanted to.
Attica. It could be Al Pacino in the afternoon.
You know, they're doing a play, they're doing Dog Day in theater. By the way, I wasn't going to tell you that, but John Watowitz, who was the Dog Day, came to Fortune. And he didn't look like Pacino when I met him. He looked like a fire pump. And he was going out for a job, and he had a big button that said, I'm Dog Day. And I said, John, come here a minute, listen. With all, I know that it gives you a lot of cred here, and it probably did when you were in the federal joint, but when you're going for a job, they don't want to know that the guy they're interviewing held 8 people hostage. So I got him to take the button off. And about 6 months later, Liz, who was the transgender that he had was robbing the bank for, played by Chris Sarandon, Liz arrived at Fortune, and I met her. She had transitioned, and I said, oh, you know, John was here 6 months ago. And she said, oh, is he here? Is he here? I don't want to stay if he's here. So I figured that relationship did not work out. But the story that I want to share with you is the kind of thing that keeps you going. In about 2015, we have a program called Alternative to Incarceration. We go to court and try to get the judge or it's usually the DA or the judge, that they would let the young man or woman come to Fortune rather than go to jail. And if they do it successfully for 6 months, they'll get probation and never have to go to jail. And it's usually younger people because they don't have a sheet, and the DA is more willing to take a chance. So this is 2015, the counselor said, we have this kid, he's wearing a Trump for president button. And I said, well, he has the right to be wrong. That's. She said, would you talk with him? So, and he's given me permission to use it. His name was Louis Torres, a teenager from the South Bronx, 19, 20 years old. And I said, you know, you're supporting Donald Trump, that's fine. What are your reasons? And he said, well, if he's good in business, if he could bring that to the country, that would be, you know, that'd be good for all of us. And I said, well, that's fine, Louis. What does he believe in? What are your issues, and how is candidate Trump dealing with that? And he said, oh, I haven't thought about that. And I said, well, why don't we start talking about that? And I'll bring a news clips, and you can. And over the next several months, he would find me, and we'd talk 2 or 3 times a week and go over it. And I realized that what it was about, what was evolving was, and this happens a lot, it wasn't about what we were talking about, is that he was being heard by an adult. And of course, along the way, I get the story, there was no father, there was no family, and that becomes an important part. And the thing is that trust is the first thing that you have to, that they don't have. They don't have trust when they come to you. They've been lied to, abandoned, abused in kid joints. So he finished his 6 months. We took him to a couple of shows at the Apollo. He loved that. And he was gone. He successfully left the ATI program and gone. And that was in 2015-16. And about 3 months ago, one of the counselors at Fortune called and said, I got some guy called and he wants you to call him. His name is Louis Torres, and it's some, and I said, oh God, he's in trouble. And I called and I said, where are you? And he said, in Florida. And I said, are you okay? He said, yeah, I'm fine. I said, and he said, I said, how are you doing? He said, well, I got married, I have 3 kids. I started doing handiwork, and it was so good that I formed my own business, and I have a couple of people working for me. And I said, Louis, that's wonderful. What prompted this call 10 years later? And he said, my wife and I were looking at YouTube last night, and you popped up talking about Attica. And I turned to my wife and I said, that's why we're here. And you don't sit around waiting for thank yous, but when somebody tells you 10 years later that they've reclaimed their life, it's why you keep doing it. Because I guess the answer is, how do you fight crime? And you do it one person at a time, and then eventually you'll have an army. And I get so upset during campaign elections because they smell up the atmosphere with their panaceas that has nothing to do with real solutions in reducing crime, because the way you reduce crime is give people who have been cut off from the mainstream of the system, give them hope and a reason to keep getting involved. And that's what Fortune Society is about, and why I've been blessed for the last 55 years being involved with it. And thank you for letting me share that.
And if you want to hear more stories like that, every